Well, good afternoon or good evening or good morning, wherever you may be. My name is Fabio Fernandez. I'm the director of Greenwich House Pottery. And one of the other rectangles here is also Jenny Lukaszowicz, who's our associate director. And we'll hear a little bit later on from our curator, Caitlin. But I just wanted to introduce you to Greenwich House Pottery for those of you that may not be familiar. We're a historic school and residency and exhibition gallery in New York City, Greenwich Village. We were founded in 1909, and there are three main legs to our stool, our chair. And it's our classes and workshops. So we have about 300 students at any given time, and they range in age from 9 years old to 99 years old. We also have a residency program where we give the opportunity for an artist to come and work in our space for 1 to 2 months. And these artists can be people that are very experienced in ceramics or people who may not have that level of experience in ceramics, and we give them the technical assistance and the resources and materials and the community to help them create work. And the third element to our Greenwich House Pottery is why we're here, and that's our exhibition program. We have a beautiful gallery on our ground floor, and most of the exhibitions that we organize there come from proposals. So every year, people from around the world will submit proposals. It's very competitive. I would say on average, maybe we get 60 proposals for about 6 to 8 slots. And that's how Magdalene came to us. I was kidding with her earlier that we've had, a good number of Canadians infiltrate our exhibition gallery, which is wonderful to see. But I will have Caitlin, who's our curator, tell us a little bit more and introduce Magdalene. But in the meantime, I welcome you to join us for Zoom classes or workshops, or if you're in New York City, please come visit. I'll turn it over to Caitlin.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for being here today. And a big thank you to Magdalene for the incredible exhibition in our space at Greenwich House Pottery. I do recommend that anyone who's in the city or close to the city schedule a time to come in and see the show in person. We will do kind of an install view, so you'll get a sense of it, but if you can come and see it in person, I definitely recommend it. But so big thank yous to everyone for coming. Thank you to Magdalene. Thank you to Brad Parsons, who I think is not with us today, but was the gallery preparator who installed the show. Some just kind of housekeeping rules. Everyone go ahead and stay on mute during the talk. At the very end of the talk and the kind of install view of the exhibition, we'll open it up to a Q&A. During the Q&A, you should feel free to unmute yourself to ask your question, or you can chat it in the chat box and I can read it out for you. If you have a really good question during the talk, but you're afraid you're going to forget it, go ahead and chat it in the chat box and I'll make sure to read it out at the end. But without any further ado, I want to introduce Magdalene Dykstra, who is an Ontario-based artist who combines her background in biology and visual arts to create sculptures, installations, and drawings that consider the human condition. Dykstra earned an MFA from Virginia Commonwealth University and an MS in Education at Niagara University. She has shown her work internationally, including at the Gardner Museum, Niagara Arts Center, Western Colorado Center for the Arts, and Pagemont Gallery. She's held residencies at Watershed, Center for the Ceramic Arts, and the Medelta Historic Clay District. Without further ado, I want to pass the proverbial microphone over to Magdalene to get us started today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's good to see familiar faces and names. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am dialing in from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work in the Niagara region. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. I'm honored to share this home with many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples whose resources and friendships are directly related to the quality of life I'm afforded in Canada. I'll jump over into my slideshow and we'll get rolling along. I also need to say thank you to the Canada Council for the Arts and the Ontario Arts Council. The support from both of these funding bodies made it possible for me to create work for this show and get it over to the Jane Hartsook Gallery. But also a huge thank you to Caitlin and Brad Parsons, the gallery preparator, who I understand isn't on Zoom, but thank you to the both of you. Caitlin and I have been in talks since 2020 when the world went sideways, and her calm, steady confidence kept me from panicking and instilled me with confidence that we could make this happen. So thank you, Caitlin. All right, so I'll be talking through the three strands that compose my work: sculpture, installation, and works on paper. The overarching ideas come from my desire to understand my position in a bigger context. So in this way, looking for a larger sort of context to position myself in, and with the ritual of repetition that shows up in my work, my artistic practice is sort of like a spiritual practice as well. The core questions that underlie all three strands of my work include asking, what does it mean to be one human among 7.8 billion and growing? And how do I reckon with the fact that I'm only one person with a limited amount of influence, but also acknowledging my complicity within the systems that have put us into the state we're in today? I use sculpture, installation, and works on paper to explore several different notes of tension. So the tension between the individual and the multiplicity of our species, the individual's insignificance versus our interconnectedness, one's visibility versus anonymity in the horde, the idea of becoming and dissolution, a sense of order versus a sense of chaos, and the tension between growth and decay. And within all of this, and within all three strands of my works, the key relationship that is always present is exploring a relationship to the earth, and injecting that content into all three strands. My work zooms in and out, taking a micro and macro view. In order to meditate on the vast number of our species, I use an aesthetic of cellular accumulation, which allows for reflection on our interconnectedness while also contemplating the insignificance of an individual. My sculptures and installations emerged from the Romantic artists of the 19th century used their paintings of grand, stormy landscapes to remind the viewer of their smallness in relation to the power present in nature. Casper David Friedrich, whose work is pictured on the left, was one of the main figures of the Romantic movement. On the right, we have a photo of me from 1,000,000 years ago, when I had the opportunity to backpack through pieces of Western Europe with a few friends. This photo was taken at the turning point of this particular hike. I was young and unprepared, so of course I was hiking in the Swiss Alps in flimsy Mary Janes. Shortly after this, we began to climb back down the mountain, but my feet and my friend's feet were both getting terribly numb. So at one point, as the sun was dipping below the mountains and we couldn't feel our toes, we were contemplating breaking into a cabin that had been locked up for the season just to save our toes. But luckily, we got a view of where we were and were able to get down the mountain with all 20 toes between the two of us. And within that little anecdote, that is the crux of the sublime. It's that dangerous edge just underneath this incredible beauty. So the first strand of my practice that I'll talk about are my sculptures. This is a wall sculpture that translates the language of the Romantic artists into my own. So this piece specifically reinterprets a painting by Casper Friedrich. And here's a picture of Friedrich's Monk by the Sea. And just down here, you can see how tiny, how insignificant the monk appears against that infinite horizon line. Instead of relying on macro landscapes, I translate this composition into a language of microbiology. So instead of that monk, we see this accumulation of cells that are wrapping around the wood panel that supports the clay work. That's an element I try to incorporate into my sculptural work and my installation work, allowing the clay to break the boundaries, break past the suggested edge of the wood panel that is serving as the host of this work. For me, my gesture, my material gesture to represent the monk is this little dribble of sort of dripping down clay, which breaks the frame. Microbial landscapes are still mysterious to us. Macro landscapes like the Alps or the Grand Canyon have become so accessible that their power over us seems to be diminished. Because we can see these places anytime we want to on our various devices, we forget how truly overwhelming they are. This image offers an example of how the work plays with the viewer's perception of scale. Not only does the title, In Each Cell a Universe, juxtapose the micro and the macro, but the work challenges AI to identify what it is. So for example, when I uploaded this image into PowerPoint, the automatically generated description suggested that this might be a rock wall. This unseen universe is so incredibly powerful that we easily see how it modifies our behavior, both as individuals, but also as a species. Paintings of the Romantic era point to our long history of exploiting those beings that we have deemed less than. For instance, access to the Western landscapes that were painted by the Hudson River School, and paintings also in Canada, for example, this one from Cornelius Krieghoff. These landscapes were accessed by campaigns of violence and attempted genocide of Indigenous peoples. We continue to categorize, to make categories that we state are less than. For example, the fact that we continue to categorize ourselves as separate from nature enables our exploitation of the earth, which is our home and nurturer. I use clay for its connection to the earth, embedding the work with implicit content. Clay is composed of the same elements we are. Our history is bound up with the history of clay. I often use red earthenware for its democratic nature. It's readily available all over the world and gets its character from so-called impurities. The armatures that support my work, made of wood and wire, are also composed of unpretentious materials that you can pick up at the hardware store, subverting ideas of what is deemed valuable. In continuing to develop my series of wall sculptures, I've been researching the abstract expressionist genre. I've had a long love affair with this genre, and then happily discovered that it linked up to my research into sublime philosophy. Barnett Newman, whose painting is pictured on this slide, sort of brought the sublime back into discussions in 1948 after it had sort of taken a break from the late 1800s when the Romantics were so fascinated with it. In 1948, Newman wrote an essay called "The Sublime Is Now," where, in contrast to the Romantic landscapes, what Newman wrote was that his colleagues, the abstract expressionists, were expressing a drive, were painting from a drive to express their relation to the absolute. And you can interpret absolute as God or the universe or whatever larger force you believe in. So instead of relying on recognizable imagery as the Romantic artists had done, the abstract expressionists used abstract means, non-representational means, to contemplate undefinable emotions and ideas. For instance, this series by Barnett Newman, the Stations of the Cross series, isn't explicitly depicting the journey of Jesus Christ to the cross. Clearly, it's his classic style of taped off regions of paint, and his sort of rip marks that he became so well known for. Instead, he titles the series to draw reference to a story of human suffering, which he had plenty of examples to pull from in his time in the 20th century. Mark Rothko, another poster boy for the abstract expressionists, spoke of invoking existential conflicts of modernity in his paintings. True to the school, he let go of any representational imagery and instead relied on fields of color to express undefinable emotions. And whenever you hear people responding to a Rothko piece, you hear quite a range of experiences from even the same piece. So that sort of fluidity, that sort of ambiguity that he leaves open for the viewer experience is quite a key characteristic that I associate with his work. Even though Rothko wasn't a religious person, he did have an early interest in religious iconography and hoped to harness some of this grandeur. So even in his single paintings, they would push beyond the scale of a human body. In this installation of 14 of his paintings at the Rothko Chapel in Houston, Texas, he has transcended all of the, I would imagine, transcended all of his singular works, his single paintings, in this installation of 14. The Rothko Chapel is a non-denominational space, which seems to me to be quite compatible with the more sort of ambiguous nature of Rothko's works. The tragedy is Rothko didn't even get to see this project completed. About a year before the chapel was finished with its construction, before the paintings were installed, Rothko died of suicide after a long struggle with depression, which again, it's that dark edge of the sublime which lies just underneath the achingly beautiful works that are shown here. Shifting off from those two poster boys of abstract expressionism, I started looking at Joan Mitchell's work, and she's become important to me for two reasons. One, in the way she spoke about her work, she tied landscape to abstract visual language. And secondly, she is one of the several women who pushed beyond the conservative gender roles of her time. With the vigor of her brushstrokes and the incredible scale of her works, she refused to play the diminutive female. So Mitchell spoke about her paintings as aiming to capture the feeling a landscape would inspire in her. And she similarly to Rothko, she looked at it as providing a metaphor for existential experience. In this piece, which I made sort of in honor or homage to Joan Mitchell, I replace her vigorous brushstrokes with microbial accumulations. Within each of my compositions, each individual cell becomes absurdly insignificant within the overall image that is being created. This piece is called "I Am Part of the Load, Not Rightly Balanced." That's a phrase pulled from a poem by Rumi. And in this piece, I'm pushing past the scale of an individual body, asking the viewer to actually move their body through space to fully appreciate what's happening in the work. So each of these panels is a little over 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, and 9 inches deep. And so in this way, scale becomes part of the content of my work. In making works that are large enough to encourage a visceral reaction, I'm hoping to encourage the viewer to reflect on their smallness, as well as the smallness of each individual cell within the larger composition. So as I mentioned before, a strategy that I like to entertain in my sculptures and installations is the transcending of suggested boundaries. So in this image, you can see the microbial forms wrapping around the frame on the right-hand side. I've been asked previously why the cells are all a sort of all operating within a similar tone, a similar color palette. I've been thinking about camouflage and what it means to feel unseen, and how there's both power and pain in feeling unseen. But at the same time, I've also been thinking about how if you zoom in close enough, we're all made of the same stuff, and those superficial divisions that we like to sort of define between groups can fade away if you zoom in close enough. I use press molds to be able to mass produce these individual cells while removing my hand from the surface of the work. In this way, each individual cell can blend into the horde. In this image, you can see all the incredible density of nylon fiber that is in the clay. This allows it to maintain some strength since it's not fired. I work primarily in unfired clay to embrace ephemerality, which I view as one of the few universal truths of the human experience. So even with this hidden matrix of support with these nylon fibers, my work teeters right on the edge of dissolution. And in the work that you see in the gallery or any of my works that you would see in person, you'll see the clay cracking around its armatures, sort of suggesting that inevitable break. Later on, I'm hoping to use a more natural support fiber. So I've been looking into hemp fiber as a substitute for nylon. But I'm still reclaiming the 800 pounds of clay that has nylon fiber that I started with in 2018. So I'll get through that first before I mix more batches of clay with hemp fiber. To bring my research up to the 21st century, having started with the Romantics in the late 1800s and then jumped to the Abstract Expressionists in the 50s and 60s, I encountered this book by James Lovelock. And this was sort of a beginning of really questioning our current relationship to the earth. Lovelock is an independent environmentalist based in the UK. And in this book, he presents his theory that the earth operates like a living organism. And like any other organism, when it gets sick, its immune system fights back. He stated that the human species operates like a virus, spreading from site to site, claiming more and more of its host, to the point of destruction. He coined this term, Polyanthropanemia, the many humans disease. In a few minutes, I'll point out some problems with this theory, but this became the jumping off point for my installation at the Gardner Museum in 2020. And this brings us to the second strand of my practice, installation. So jumping off of Lovelock's theory, I began to think about what it would look like if the earth began to fight back, starting with this gallery space. This wall is 16 feet tall and 35 feet wide. So it allowed me to really push that idea of engaging the viewer's body and engaging the viewer with a visceral response to the work as opposed to purely visual. So again, to fully grasp this piece, the viewer would have to get close, get far, and actually move through the space of the gallery, since there's no one vantage point that can allow the viewer to see everything that's going on in the work. The microbial forms push out from between the space between the drop ceiling and the wall. They colonize the space, disrespecting suggested boundaries, wrapping around corners, and even leaving the gallery altogether. This tidal wall sits just outside of the gallery, the entrance to the gallery would be on the left. And behind here on the right, you can see a chair. Just back there is the museum restaurant. So when I was installing this strange disease-like work, I got a kick out of looking over the top of this tidal wall and seeing people enjoying their lunch, wondering what the heck I was doing. This installation was intended to grow throughout the exhibition period. The show opened on March 5th, 2020. So that tells you what happened in the next few months. Like everything else, the museum was shut down. But while this infection continued to occupy the gallery of the Gardner Museum, the COVID-19 infection was spreading recklessly throughout the world. And we started to read about theories of how it might have originated, which led a lot of writing, a lot of thinking about our relationship, not only to the planet, but our relationship to animals and how our relationship to animals we raise for food. Emma Gilchrist wrote for the Narwhal that the story of COVID-19 is at its core a story of humanity's ever-encroaching relationship with all other living things on this planet. She was writing in response to the theories that COVID may have jumped from animal species at wet markets in China. In her article, in Gilchrist's article, she quoted an earlier article from 2012 written by Jim Robbins. And even back then, he suggested that disease is largely an environmental issue, stating that 60% of emerging infectious diseases are originated in animals and jump to our species. So with these quotes, I was thinking about not only the link between environmental degradation, environmental exploitation, and the negative impacts, but I was also starting to think about other aspects of figuring out our relationship to our environment. So at this point, I want to jump back to James Lovelock's theory and the term he coined, Polyanthropanemia. And I just want to make sure I highlight an issue that comes from his theory. Unfortunately, environmentalism has a long history of blending racist ideology with its concerns for our planet. So when we start thinking about concerns of overpopulation, and when that is blended with racist ideology, those two make for quick bedfellows to lead us into ideas around eugenics and thinking about who should be avoided and who should be eliminated to solve this overpopulation issue. So to pivot away from that idea, to pivot away from Lovelock's idea that this is a population problem, while I think it's certainly part of the issue, I think the question we need to start asking, rather than who has to be eliminated in a situation of overpopulation, instead, I think the question needs to be who has done the bulk of the consumption, who has done the bulk of the exploitative mining of resources, whether that applies to inert material resources or living material resources. And then once we start asking who has done the bulk of this exploitation, who has taken the bulk of the Earth's resources and contributed dramatically to the state we're in now, how can we redirect the momentum of our species in a significant way? So the museum reopened following new health and safety guidelines, and so the installation was indeed able to continue to expand. Existing clusters of cells were able to sort of bud and sprout new modules, slowly filling up the original gallery wall. But the installation also jumped to new territory altogether, finding a new location to grow in this corner of the gallery. Back in the studio, I was continuing to explore how I could visualize the vastness of our species. In this test installation, Vast Field of Interbeing, the microbial forms gathered, clustered, and billowed over the edges of a low platform. This aesthetic of interconnectedness stands in contrast to the messaging we're given from various sources that, in fact, we're individuals isolated and alone. Whether our lived experience might match those messages or not, this work points out that each individual cell is actually born out of the same material foundation. Bell Hooks, in her book Art on My Mind, spoke about the crucial, the power of reflecting on our interconnectedness. She says, "It is only through the recognition of the commonness of human experience, in contrast to elitism and separatism imposed by systems of domination that reinforce the powers of church and state, that individuals can live in harmony without engendering violence against ourselves or others. As Jane Bennett states or suggests in her book, Vibrant Matter, I believe that materials have a vibrant sort of agency or intelligence that we don't fully understand. And for this reason, my practice is equally rooted in material experimentation as it is in more traditional forms of research. As this installation dried, anyone who's worked with clay knows it shrinks. And so it embodied a long-standing truth that those who are living on the margins are more dramatically, more unfortunately affected by various crises like COVID, like climate change, than those who occupy more privileged spaces. As a species, we've been around for quite a long time, and we seem to move in a sort of a corkscrew direction. We tend to cycle through a lot of the same mistakes that we made ages and ages ago, seemingly not learning a thing, but slowly perhaps evolving forward, moving down that corkscrew. In this piece called Accumulation of Dust Made Flesh, I was thinking about the millennia of humans that have gone before us and how societies have always built upon the bones of the previous ones. And this brings up another reason why I am absolutely in love with clay as a medium. It holds the memory of the earliest artists. So I like to imagine that the clay I use has some sort of distant, perhaps intergenerational sort of memory of this cow and bull bison that sit in a cave in France. Or at least maybe my materials remember all the previous iterations that I've put them through, all those previous forms they've taken. And so with every reclamation of the material I use, with every new project, I like to think that the material is carrying all those memories, all that previous content with them, and so just continuing to build upon itself. With this installation, I was also thinking about minimalism and how minimalism sort of positioned itself as a neutral or objective sort of art form, but there's not really any, that doesn't really exist. Anna Chave wrote about this in an article in Arts Magazine, where she was saying minimalist artists are interchangeable, they're neutral, and perhaps even neutered because of that neutrality, because they are flattening differences and neutralizing any sort of disparities in order to come under some sort of exchangeability. So riffing off of that idea that minimalist objects, minimalism, aimed to neutralize differences in order to become quote unquote objective, I was becoming more and more exhausted with the idea of white as the default. So instead of using just one clay body and flattening differences, I used 3 different clay bodies to think about celebrating those differences, celebrating the differences between people and experiences. But because this installation was made of 3 different clay bodies, they shrunk at different rates and fault lines opened up between them. Also, the bottom of the cube is crumbling, which you can just barely see at the bottom of the image. And so this piece sort of operates on a spectrum of becoming and undoing. It could continue to build up strata ad infinitum, but it's also crumbling at the bottom. One of the reasons I'm so interested in the installation format and just get so excited when I have the opportunity to work in that format is that it does its very best to resist a capitalist model. Installations can be messy, impermanent, and difficult to package for tidy consumption. With this installation, I was thinking about one of the myths of capitalism, which is the myth that we can continue to grow, we can continue to accumulate with no limit. But as we continue to try for that, as we continue to try to build wealth based on exploiting resources, whether inert or living, we leave behind parched earth. So now we come to the third strand of my practice, and we'll get to the images of the show. So the third strand is my works on paper. As I was researching the abstract expressionist genre, I was looking for artists who could push back against the way that abstract expressionism maintained the dominance of white artists, heterosexual artists, male artists. So I was looking for artists, other people who could poke holes in the idea that these are my artistic forebears. And in doing that, I found Alma Thomas, who I would like to call one of my art moms. Alma Thomas was making work in the 50s and 60s. And as a Black woman, she often encountered criticism for not explicitly dealing with her racialized identity in her work. This was during the Civil Rights Movement, when a lot of other artists of color were making work that was explicitly depicting their racialized experiences in an attempt to use their art as a call for change. But Thomas resisted. She refused the idea that abstract art couldn't be synonymous with Black art. And she refused the pressure from anyone else to dictate what she should make. And so in continuing with her explorations of abstraction and her joyful relationship with color, she consistently asserted her right to self-definition. I believe that art at its core is sometimes no more complex than stating, I am here, I am here, I was here. So blending reference to these hand silhouettes in prehistoric caves with Alma Thomas's pixelated work with color, I came to this finger painting series where I repeatedly assert my presence by leaving the print of my body, my fingerprint. I use local clays and naturally occurring oxides to maintain that, to continue to reflect on my relationship with the earth and my complete dependence on it, being made of the same elements. And so now we get to the show. So the show that is in the Jane Hartsook Gallery rotates, sort of hinges on the sculpture that you see in the center. The title of the show, All Gilded Landscapes and Glistening Shows Fade, is pulled from a Rumi poem, a poem by Rumi. And I was drawn to that phrase because it suggests beauty, but it also suggests its ultimate decay. So for the sculpture in the center, I was facing the challenge of not being able to come into the gallery and install on site, which was the original plan. So instead, what I started doing was thinking about ways that I could introduce an architecture against which the microbial form could push. And I was looking at Sol LeWitt's minimalist sculptures and his sort of framed cubes that he made several iterations of, and found that as a sort of a foundation against which this work could push. So the unfired clay billows above and below, sort of taking on bodily connotations. And just as in my other installations and sculptural work, the clay refuses to obey any suggested boundaries. And so the title of this work, Framed Landscape, is sort of tongue-in-cheek because the frame isn't succeeding. It's not framing this landscape. The microbial landscape is pushing past and suggesting where else it might run off to. The largest finger painting, the largest work on paper in the show, is this scroll piece called Tendency to Persist. I was thinking again about all the humans who have gone before me and all those who will come after me, and also sort of loosely thinking about ancient religious texts which would have been written on scrolls, and thinking about the Book of Life as well. So there were three things coming into this piece. Thinking about the long lineage of humans that is going to continue past me for at least a little while. Thinking about ancient scrolls, and thinking about the Book of Life, which in the Christian and Judaic tradition, the Book of Life was the document where all the names, God would write all the names of the people who would get into heaven. So pulling those three thoughts together, this piece documents the trace of my presence as good enough for making the cut. Summer Storms is just across the gallery from the scroll piece. With this one, I wanted to occupy a space related to my body with this work. So this piece sits at about 5'6" tall and 5'6" wide. So in that way, it's sort of implying the scale of my body, just as the fingerprints imply the presence/absence of my body. And I made this in June, this past summer, when wildfires out in BC, in Western Canada, and also in Northern Ontario were forcing people to leave their homes. And the smoke from those wildfires, both out west and in Northern Ontario, was seeding clouds that was then drenching Southern Ontario. So I was thinking about, as the curtains of rain were just falling down so heavily and rhythmically on my roof, I was also thinking about the sheets of smoke that people would have been running away from as they were fleeing the wildfires. At the back of the gallery by the window, two finger paintings are sort of facing off. Goldenrod is on one side, and it pulls inspiration from my wildflower garden here at home. Goldenrods are, they're wildflowers. They're often regarded as weeds and mowed away, but they're actually really helpful participants in their ecosystems. So not only do they attract butterflies and bees, encouraging them to stick around the area and pollinate other plants, but they'll draw away, goldenrod will draw away unhelpful insects from my vegetable garden. The last piece in the gallery, Sumac, sits across from goldenrod, so sort of creating a bit of a garden in the gallery is what I was thinking. And sumac is also pulled, the inspiration is pulled from a plant that is very present around my area of Southern Ontario, and I think through a lot of the eastern US as well. So with sumac, I was looking at these plants all around me and picturing the fields of them that I would pass by. Sumac, not only does it provide hardy shelter for small mammals and birds, but it's also really effective in erosion control and sort of making escarpments more sturdy, preventing against mudslides. But you can also drink it and use it as spices. So I thought I would finish my talk with a recipe, which I have tried. So, you know, it shouldn't be so bad. I do want to point out, you know, the big caveat that never consume any plant matter without being 110% sure of what you're consuming. But if you look at these images, the Staghorn Sumac, which grows around me and throughout the eastern United States, has these upright clustered red berries that you see over on the right-hand side. Poison sumac, which you see on the left, tends to grow in swamp areas. So if you're not in a swamp area, you might be getting lucky, but also getting lucky in terms of accessing Staghorn Sumac, that is. But also the berries are white on poison sumac, and they don't cluster like the red berries of Staghorn Sumac. So with that recipe left out there in the breeze, I'll stop my screen share and cheers with my sumac tea. And I'm happy to answer any questions. So feel free to unmute and comment or question.
Okay, we have a few questions in the chat. So let me go ahead and start with those, and then anyone else should feel free to add in. So Chelsea asks, when most artists first use clay, they tend to think of it as a permanent or unchanging. They think of it as permanent or unchanging. When/how did you start to think of using clay in a more ephemeral way? Has it changed the way you view other works of art made with clay?
I can pinpoint it. It was 2014. I attended a workshop led by Walter McConnell, another like just amazing artist who works with unfired clay. And the freedom that came with taking that rule away, I just couldn't let go of that. So July 2014. Has it changed the way I view other works of art made with clay? I mean, I'm still blown away with what people can manage to get through a kiln firing because I don't subject myself to that anymore much. So I guess it just gives me that much more respect for people who still play by that specific rule.
And we've got another question. This one is from Allison. You speak about your clay works as active beings. They grow, billow, push, refuse, etc. This use of active verbiage gives the material agency as a vibrant matter. It also puts you in a passive role, somewhat erasing your labor. Yeah. Is the latter, sorry, I'm scrolling. Is the latter purposeful? Do you actively avoid describing your process and verbs of your action, building, planning, forming, etc.?
That's a really interesting question. I see myself as collaborating with the clay. I don't mind the idea of sort of erasing a little bit of my agency with that sculptural work, because I mean, a big piece of what I'm thinking about is how I don't know what a better way to say this is, but I don't matter. Like, I'm just one person, right? I matter so much, like in terms of my interconnectedness to the people around me, but I kind of like pushing against that individualistic, sort of culture that I've been inculcated to. But I mean, that said, there's tons of building, planning, forming, editing.
Those are the questions we have in the chat. If anyone else has a question, please feel free to go ahead and ask it. But if we don't have any other questions, I'll kind of as an outro, I'll play kind of just a video that plays still images of the exhibition. But I want to open the floor one more time in case anyone else has any burning questions. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just kind of play this, series of still photos. You should feel free to stay the whole time. I know it's 6 o'clock, maybe people have to leave. So I'm going to say thank you so much to everyone for being here, and thank you so much to Magdalene for such a wonderful show. And oh, yep, we're getting a few more chats. Lots of thank yous. So I'll go ahead and play this video. All right, thank you everyone so much. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Magdalene.
Thanks, everyone.